It's really no secret that the 1990s pushed the boundaries of decency and good taste in pop culture, whether that be music, TV, or movies, and especially comic books.
I'm Todd McFarlane, and I created Spawn. I hope you'll consider the question I've just posed, because a man named Al Simmons...
I think officially this era of comics is called the Copper Age, but if you ask any old school comic fan, this was the Dark Ages. Everything was grim, gritty, dark, and ultra-violent. Everything was covered in blood. Blood Strike, Young Bloods, Bloodshot, Blood Wolf. Rob Liefeld made a career putting blood in front of things. While the comic book industry was shifting to this grim and gritty approach, Transformers was not immune to this. See, we've talked before about how the 1990s weren't exactly kind to the franchise, at least not until Beast Wars, and the Generation 2 comic is really the best example of this. The G2 action figures were covered in day-glow paint decos, with ghost missile launchers, and all kinds of crazy gimmicks, whether that be lights and sounds, lasers, water cannons, anything. But this bodacious and brash toy line is really a far cry from the Generation 2 comic. The G2 comic is definitely indicative of the era. It's full of dark colors, gritty character design, tons of ultra-violence, and just this overall overwhelming apocalyptic feel to the entire story arc. This brings us to the central antagonist of the Generation 2 comic. No longer are we dealing with the Megatron Optimus Prime dynamic, instead we introduce a third party, the Cybertronia Empire led by the battle axe known as Jhiaxus. This is the 2022 Generations Legacy Jhiaxus, and this is actually the first action figure based off of the G2 comic design. The action figure does a really great job of encapsulating the very exaggerated aesthetic that artist Derek Yaniger used in the Generation 2 comic. Aesthetically speaking, Jhiaxus is a very strange figure. He has a very classic Transformers shape and design, but it's all highlighted by these very grotesque little details, such as the loose wires on his legs that kind of look like varicose veins, and the very sour and dour face. It kind of looks like he's practicing sour face Kempo like in One Punch Man. Something kind of interesting and odd about Jhiaxus is the fact that his design was made exclusively for the comic books. So when it's translated from the comic art to toy, it almost gives him superhero proportions and appearance. As silly as it sounds, this Man of Steel here is built like an Adonis, much more akin to almost a Marvel Legends figure, really. Usually when a Transformer is depicted as more physically imposing, they're extra blocky or boxy, or can become extra monstrous like the giant Dorito from the 2007 movie. I mean, especially considering that Jhiaxus' color scheme is primarily a slate white, it almost makes it look like he's cut from marble, like he's some sort of Transformer from the Hellenistic age, especially with the fact that he's got these little Hermes-type wings on his ankles. When it comes to accessories, Jhiaxus includes 2 guns. He's got a big red rifle, and then a smaller, kind of submachine gun looking doodad. The rifles are based directly off of the G2 comic art, and they feel very indicative of the time. The big, chunky, blocky proportions remind me of the stupidly big guns Cable and Bishop would tote around in the X-Men comics. He also includes this sensor reticle that's on his shoulder. It's very reminiscent of the vents that we'd see in the original Generation 1 Seekers, and you can also remove the light pips and fold away the reticle itself. The little removable pips can be added to the large red rifle, but we'll see that more in vehicle mode. Now, to be perfectly frank, I really dislike this vehicle mode, but at the same time, I don't know what they could have done. In the G2 comic books, Jhiaxus' alt mode design is very much derived from the space boat sweep design, with some added gothy wings. The issue comes in with the fact that Jhiaxus' robot mode and vehicle mode designs were made whole cloth for the comics, with no toy in mind. So the transformation from one to the other is completely incongruous. So cutting to 2022, they just had to make something up. And while I understand that, I don't like it. I think the alt mode is very ugly and just completely malformed. It looks like a stretched out F-15 or a way too bulky Harrier jet. It just doesn't work for me. And seeing as we're talking about things I don't particularly like on this figure, it's going to be the only time to mention the plastic quality. For the past few years, Hasbro's had some trouble with their plastics photo-degrading, which is to say, they discolor with exposure to light. In Jhiaxus' case, instead of turning yellow, his white plastic turns a weird greenish color. It's not the worst, but it is a quality control issue nonetheless. So for his role in the Generation 2 comic, Jhiaxus falls into a lot of the same trappings that Marvel villains do, which is to say, he is this stoic, unflinching, very powerful character who outmatches our heroes, but his downfall really comes at the last minute when he starts losing his cool and losing his shit. So in the 4 million years of Optimus Prime and Megatron duking it out across the galaxy, there was a splintered group of Cybertronians who decided to do their own thing. This thing being budding, a weird asexual form of reproduction for the Transformers where they split. And the more and more they bud, essentially the less and less of a soul they have as they are further away from Primus, the Transformer creator god. It's a very strange, esoteric, almost magical way of thinking that I'm glad has never returned in the Transformers. And because these Transformers don't really have any moral compass and no interest in the war, they decide to go found their own empire and start a systematic conquest and cleansing of the universe. For simplicity's sake, I'm gonna call Jhiaxus and his crew Spacists. I'm sure you can guess what that's a portmanteau of. So after millions of years off in their own part of the universe, Jhiaxus and his crew of Spacists learn that Optimus Prime and Megatron are still continuing the war on Earth. Jhiaxus abducts Optimus Prime to give him a verbal undressing, essentially telling him that he sucks, his life is pointless, the war was pointless, and that the Cybertronian Empire is going to spread with or without him.
While you were still learning how to spell your name, I was being trained to conquer galaxies.
So after both the Autobots and Decepticons are individually defeated by Jhiaxus, Prime and Megatron decide the only way they can survive is to team up. Now, Jhiaxus and the Cybertronian Empire are a well-organized fighting force. They're an imperialistic army with overwhelming power. But the issue is, the Autobots and Decepticons are a group of wild cards. They have two things Jhiaxus doesn't have: the power of being a main character, and vast, dramatic unpredictability. So even though he remains very stoic, the melodrama between the Autobots and Decepticons really drives Jhiaxus up the wall. And this culminates in Starscream, the wildest of all wild cards, selling out the combined Autobot-Decepticon force.
No, I'm saying, no, the brakes! Guys, why aren't the brakes working?
Because I cut the brakes! Wild card, bitches! Yeah! What?
This is all a cover for Starscream's own inner machinations. While Jhiaxus, Prime, and Megatron are duking it out to the death, Starscream can steal the creation matrix from Prime and Megatron's war world, that being a literal planet-sized battleship. This goes badly for everybody involved, and the battle just turns into a huge bloodbath, essentially. So at the end of the Generation 2 comic, we see Jhiaxus turn from this monolithic, immovable, and unemotional character to a violent, reckless, neurotic character with a self-destructive fixation on killing Optimus Prime and Megatron. The Legacy Jhiaxus figure really stands apart from the other Generations-era figures Hasbro's been producing. While these other Generations figures are based off of animated appearances or other comic books, they're all derived from toy designs made by Hasbro in one way, shape, or form. In my opinion, Jhiaxus is very unique in that he's essentially a Marvel Comics villain that just happened to be a Transformer. So I really feel like this figure captures that overall comic book feeling and aesthetic in the same way Marvel Legends tend to, or even some of the high-end Mafex figures, where it just leaps off of the page and right onto the toy shelf.